As the last few years have clearly demonstrated, the structure of rugby in Wales isn't working as effectively as other countries. This in part has led to our professional and national teams slipping further and further down the pecking order at the top table of rugby. In response to this, the Welsh Rugby Union has introduced the new SRC League in an attempt to bridge the gap between the semi-professional and professional game in Wales. A knock-on effect of this is trimming down of the top Welsh division to 10 teams, and of these 10 teams, there is one famous Welsh club that has been left out in the cold. A club with a rich history that was formed all the way back in 1871, making it the oldest club team in Wales. That club is of course the Welsh All Blacks, Neath RFC. The history of Neath is a tumultuous story to say the least. They have had times of massive success, boasting amazing records and producing some of the greatest names to ever wear the red jersey. But they have also had times where things have not been as rosy, and financial issues have sometimes threatened the very existence of this great historic club. Now, the complete history of Neath is far too broad to fit into a YouTube video, but the brief overview is, as rugby began to spread more and more across Wales, young men began to join together to establish local teams. Neath was the first team to do this in Wales, and they would start the ball rolling to what eventually would lead to be the governing body that runs rugby in Wales. In 1880, one of their players, Dick Gordon, sustained an injury on the field against Bridgend, tragically leading him to lose his life. This is believed to be the genesis of the famous black jersey, as a mark of their respect to their fallen teammate. A year later is when the newly formed clubs would come together to unify Welsh rugby under one banner. And on the 12th of June, 11 clubs met in a Neath hotel and would form the Welsh Football Union. And this governing body is what we would eventually come to call the Welsh Rugby Union. Interestingly, out of the 11 teams that were in attendance, Neath was actually not noted down as one of them. And this is really strange when you consider they were the first team to be created in Wales, and this seminal meeting was actually being held in Neath. Very strange. To this day, they don't exactly know why Neath's name wasn't down on the list. It could literally be something as simple as a recording error, or the prevailing theory is that John Llewellyn and Sam Clark, who were prominent members of the South Wales Football Union, and both men of Neath, did not attend because the forming of this union was effectively putting their smaller union out of business, and they would not recognise the new governing body. Shortly after this though, Neath would join the WFU, quickly becoming an integral part of the union, and the aforementioned Sam Clark would eventually become Neath's first player to represent Wales. Not only were they a big part off the pitch, but on the pitch they were a side to be feared. In the 1988-89 season, which entailed 47 games, Neath scored 345 tries, accumulating 1,917 points. Now that's over 7 tries a game for anyone who's counting, absolutely wild. In 1945, Guy Stevens became the first player from Neath to captain Wales, and littered across the club's history has been many players who got a chance to swap the black jersey for the red of Wales. Just a handful of these names include the likes of Shane Williams, Adam Jones, Gareth Llewellyn and Jonathan Davis, just to name but a few. There's also been many successful seasons, particularly when the game was amateur. They won multiple cups and championships, and of course the old Snelling Sevens a couple of times. The famous Knoll Ground became a feared place to visit. They had players like Brian Thomas and Brian Williams who were feared in their time for their physical and hard edge that they brought to the game. It really can't be understated the contribution that this club has made to Welsh rugby since its conception. But where it began to run into difficulty though is once the professional era came in. Like many sides in Wales, Neath had to all of a sudden go from paying nobody to coming up with ways to afford to contract the players they already had and bring new ones in. And like many other Welsh clubs, they struggled with juggling the finances and found themselves in financial difficulties. Unlike some of the other clubs, Neath did not have a financial backer who could keep adding money to the club and bailing them out when they had an issue. Eventually, this all came to head in 1998, with the club on the brink of going bust with debts of around $600,000 and no way to pay it back. The WRU saw no other option than to step in to save the oldest rugby club in Wales. They did this by setting up a business consortium under the name Gower Park, and they were tasked with owning and governing Neath RFC. And in fairness, this steadied the ship for a time, but realistically it was just a band-aid. Gower Park was never going to be Neath's long-term plan. Then in the summer of 2003, as regional rugby was brought into the Welsh game, Neath were brought by another consortium, this time of local businessmen, returning the club back to the local fans. As Neath Rugby Limited, led by Geraint Hawkes, took over, the original consortium that was led by the WRU Gower Park actually went into liquidation as they were no longer needed to keep the club afloat, going under with debts of over £700,000 still left on the books. On the whole though, this was seen as a positive thing, as it was great to see the club back in the hands of local businessmen and fans. And this did give the rugby club a period of stability, as they had seasons of varying success in the Welsh Premiership, but money troubles were never that far away. And unfortunately, it wasn't only the club's financial problems that were causing trouble at the Knoll, but actually in 2015, they found themselves all of a sudden smack bang in the middle of a fraud case. So it's important to point out before I start this that the court issue is actually nothing to do with the club as an entity, but in the summer of 2015, the current chairman, Geraint Hawkes, was found guilty by a judge of fraud and was deemed to be unfit to manage a company and therefore was banned from being a company director for 10 years. He also got his mum wrapped up in this somehow, and she received the same 10-year ban. As it transpired, Hawkes owed roughly $1.5 million in unpaid VAT to the taxman, and this stemmed from the financial issues that his plywood company FM Hawkes came into, which had gone into administration in 2011. Now, I'm not a financial expert, but from what I read and gathered, Mr. Hawkes tried to portray the VAT going unpaid as if it was an accident that he didn't realise had happened. But once they got into the books, it was found that fraudulent behaviour had led him to cook his books to make it seem like the company wasn't struggling as much as it actually was. Where Neath got wrapped up in this was, it seemed as though Mr. Hawkes used his position in the club to make it seem as though his company had loaned a large sum of money to the rugby club, and that this loan was going to be repayable. But, by all accounts, it was agreed that this money was never going to get paid back. And he didn't just do it to Neath, he also had money on his books from another company that had already gone into liquidation, which he knew, but he left it on the books, so it seemed as though he was going to get returns on the loan, again making his financial situation seem a lot better. And to top all this off, he was a 50% stakeholder in the club, so it just made things so much more difficult. The whole thing left a stain on the club, which, to be fair, it did not deserve. Thankfully, it quickly moved past this part of its history, and the controlling stake was taken over by Mike Cuddy. Cuddy is actually a name that probably a lot of Welsh fans will recognise. He had a lot to do with the forming of the Ospreys, and he was a big part of the early success that the region had with the Galacticos and stuff like that. He was a big part of that. He was a no-nonsense businessman who took no prisoners but knew how to get the job done. And when you consider the early success the Ospreys had, winning the league multiple times, you could sort of understand why Cuddy taking over was generally looked at as a positive thing. Now in charge, Cuddy managed to stabilise things for a while, and in a somewhat desperate attempt to regain some of the glory for the club, he decided to get his old mate Lynn Jones, who no doubt would have commanded a fairly decent wage, in to run the rugby side of things, and also brought in players like Regan King, maybe in an attempt to do like a similar thing he did in the Ospreys, and maybe he wanted to make his own little Premiership version of the Galacticos. This was never going to be sustainable to start with, but an incident where Cuddy actually collapsed at his home and ended up spending 6 months in the hospital, and this actually unfortunately led to his business falling apart and going bust without his direct leadership. Cuddy was a complete workaholic and quite often got by on just a couple of hours sleep every night, and I think eventually his body just couldn't sustain that type of effort anymore. Without any money coming in and his financial backer broke, the club didn't have any funds to pay its now quite hefty wage bill. Lynn Jones decided to cut his losses and took the job with Russia, who were preparing for the Rugby World Cup. And now with no money at the club, a lot of the stars that were brought in began to leave and Cuddy was forced to take out a £30,000 loan just in order to pay everyone's wages. It's actually so tragic. Don't get me wrong, there's clearly been a lot of mismanagement of funds over the history of the club, but there's been so many times where circumstances out of their control has ended up bringing issues to the front gates of the Knoll. All of this, of course, left Neath once again in an extremely precarious position, and now with a completely depleted squad and seemingly no plan on how to replenish it, it seems like the team's bad form and the bad run of luck was going to continue. And in fact, they ended up having to forfeit games because they weren't able to field a team. As the fans clambered around for some answers as what was going to happen, Mr. Cuddy put on a defiant attitude and promised, though he had no finances and no way to back up these claims, he promised that no matter what happened, he would not leave the club and would not allow Neath to fold and collapse into nothing. But the fans didn't accept this and they demanded change. Before change could come though, there was more issues, as Neath's bank accounts were froze and the future of the oldest club in Wales looked extremely bleak. The WRU would not be able to bail them out again, and they were now facing a winding up order for failing to repay the £30,000 loan which was taken out to cover the wages. I mean, it's just a mess. And to be honest, it's been quite difficult finding all the information and getting the correct details for this video. And I did just want to thank one of my subscribers, Gareth, who is a big Neath fan and helped me with a couple of the details for the video, so cheers mate. Anyway, by the beginning of 2019, Mike Cuddy's position was simply untenable, and in fairness, he took the decision to hand the club over to the financial company Jardine Norton, the same Jardine Norton who had previously bought the £30,000 winding up order against the club. The club would now be run in a partnership with the owners and volunteers as a management team. This again, in theory, would at least return the club to its fans, but it was unfortunately too late to save the club's premiership status, as they were relegated with 7 games left to play in that season. The following few years actually returned a little bit of calm to the Welsh All Blacks as they consolidated their position in the Welsh Championship, and thankfully it was only a matter of time before one of Wales's greatest clubs returned back to the top table where they belonged. This, unfortunately though, is where our current issue comes in. As I mentioned at the start, and most of you probably know, as Neath returned to the top table, there was another restructure to the setup of rugby in Wales, and the WRU brought in the idea of reducing from 13 teams down to 10 in an attempt to concentrate and consolidate all the better players into a smaller amount of teams to increase the overall standard, which of course makes logical sense. The WRU would be open to applications from all of the Welsh Premier Division teams and would apparently be talking to them all and taking them all on their own individual merit. The only exception to this was RGC, as they wanted some representation in the north, which I completely agree with. But where it started to get messy was initially the 3 Cardiff region clubs, these of course being Cardiff, Ponty and Merthyr, decided that taking part in this competition was not financially viable, and in fact Ponty suggested that if they were to take part in the EDC as what it was at the time, it might actually push them under. That meant that there were 10 spots left for the 10 remaining teams, but once the applications went in, everyone was accepted, bar Neath. The reasons given by the union was due to general financial troubles. They felt that Neath weren't solid enough or on a solid enough financial footing to be taking part in this competition. And they also pointed out that their relationship with Neath, which had been slightly fractured over the last few years, wasn't really good enough, and they needed everyone to be working together and singing off the same hymn sheet, which I do sort of get. Neath were understandably disappointed and upset, calling it grossly unfair, pointing out the fact that the relationship with the Ospreys had really improved over recent years, and now the club was back on a solid financial footing. Given the club's stern reaction to not being brought in, the WRU allowed them to submit a second application and would be happy to conduct further talks. Of course, the real elephant in the room was the fact that the competition, for it to make any sense, needed some representation from the Cardiff region. Because, of course, as the union had pointed out, unless everyone was singing off the same hymn sheet, the competition was just doomed to fail before it started. What the conversations were at this point, we will never know, but it seems that pretty much out of nowhere, to be honest, Cardiff RFC had a change of heart and now decided that they wanted to be part of the SRC and they would be putting in an application that would rival Neath's for the final spot. Neath's PR team did everything they could to drum up support. They went on a social media campaign, getting the backing from former greats like Jonathan Davis and Shane Williams, but of course there was only going to be one winner in this two-horse race, and yet again the All Blacks' hopes were dashed. And this now kind of brings us full circle. It's quite a tough one because the number of teams had to be reduced for this competition to work, and that does obviously mean someone has to lose out. Add on top of that, they have to have some sort of representation from the Cardiff region, otherwise there's no cohesion and development across the board. It just makes no sense. And finally, the history of the financial troubles with this once great club almost going to the wall multiple times, and of course being bailed out back in the 90s, you can kind of understand why the WRU aren't willing to put their faith in the club. Having said all of that, you have a team with so much history and so much past success, and it's really hard to see them getting left out in the cold, and it leaves an amazing club and an extremely passionate and loyal fan base, slightly maligned, left probably feeling quite bitter about the lot they've been dealt, and in all honesty, I think they deserve a little bit better. But with the SRC being ring-fenced for the first 3 years, there's not really anything they can do about it now, other than trying to maintain their success in the Premiership, where there is still some big teams like Ponty and Merthyr, but without there being big Welsh clashes on a regular basis to help push the turnstiles at the famous Knoll ground, the situation has really left me worried, thinking this sleeping giant might never wake up again. Thanks for watching.